Hi, this is Teddy, and today you're listening to Marcus Baram, Project Director of the 5100 Pay Gap series on Capitol and Maine, on Two Broads Talking Politics. Get your vaccine!
Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly. This is Two Broads Talking Politics. I am on today with Marcus Baram, who is a veteran business journalist and is the project director for a new series out from Capitol in Maine called the 5100 Pay Gap. So hi, Marcus.
Hi. Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining me. So a while back, we had a couple of other people from Capitol and Maine on to talk about another project, and I'm just so intrigued by the reporting and the work that is done by Capitol and Maine. Could you tell me a little bit about just sort of the general outline of what this 5100 Pay Gap project is about, sort of what the aims of it are?
Sure thing. So, we have covered a lot about income inequality at Capitol in Maine. We actually had a series run during the 2020 campaign called United States of Inequality, which looked more at looking at the issue through the lens of the campaign and what was being discussed in the campaign and looking at battleground states. So it's an issue that we're very concerned about and report about a lot. And then last fall, the RAND Corporation, a pretty middle of the road, not a lefty think tank, they've been around for many years. They released this groundbreaking study that really very thoroughly documented this massive income shift to the richest Americans since the early 1970s. And according to their research, a full-time worker earning the median income of $50,000 today would be making close to $100,000 if the nation's economic growth had been shared, like as it had been from the end of World War II to the early 1970s. And that statistic kind of stuck out to us. It was kind of stunning because even for us, we were very, all too familiar with how income inequality has grown in the last few decades, especially you could say in the last 10 years. And most Americans, I think, would, know that there is this phenomenon and that they haven't gotten a raise in 10 years or 15 years. Their neighbors haven't. They have less money to pay and spend on, whether it's the mortgage or groceries, but not that it's that extreme. To think that, somebody making $50,000 today, which is kind of the average median income, would be making or should be making double that if those trends had continued, was sort of shocking to us. And so it inspired the name of the project. Right away we thought, wow, that 50-100 is a very compelling title for a series that further looks into income inequality. And so that became the title of the series, 5100 Pay Gap. And then we wanted to focus in a much more in-depth way than I've seen before. What are the real causes of this extreme income inequality? And not looking at just what you read about, what most people assume is the causes when they look at, obviously, the decline in unionization across the country, globalization, the role of technology. Those are all factors. But there's also a lot of other factors that we're just sort of learning about or just becoming more aware of that involve policy changes that happened in the 70s and especially in the 80s, where either it was, tax code changes or legislation or, business lobby decisions that ended up exacerbating this income inequality and kind of setting us on the road where we are today. And so what we wanted to do was to look at what actually happened and who were the people, to borrow from Hamilton, we want to know, who were the people in the room when those decisions were made, and what groups and think tanks and lobbyists and economists were involved in crafting those decisions that ended up transferring literally trillions of dollars from working Americans into the hands of either the wealthy or Wall Street firms and took it away from working Americans. So that became kind of the focus of the series. And it has kind of three legs to it. Basically, part of it involves looking at those reasons, looking at the causes, and doing some in-depth reporting about that. The second part is, human impact stories that tell the story of how that has played out. And we've published a number of those. One of them looked at a family that's a GE family, where most of the families worked for the local GE factory for the last 60 years outside of Boston, Mass. and Lynn, Mass. We also did a three-part story about a married couple who were social workers in Arizona and how their profession and their individual lives have been impacted by the low wages that social workers get. We have a story coming up about teachers in Florida, which is one of the states that has the lowest pay rates for teachers. So a lot of those human impact stories that bring it home for people. And one thing I want to focus on with those stories is looking at generational income inequality, which to me is uniquely compelling because in America, we always prize the idea of social mobility and the idea that you can always, and parents want that. They want their kids to, go beyond what they've made and, buy a bigger house and have a greater life. I see that in my own family. When my great-great-grandfather came to this country from Russia in early 20th century, his profession on the census form was junk peddler. That's what he did. He basically sold junk. In his little shtetl in Russia, he went around selling pots and pans. And then my father, his great-grandson was a lawyer in Boston. And I'm not sure if I'm, beyond that, but it just that myth of American mobility. And that has been destroyed. And what you see is within families, even if they're working in the same profession, they're working at the same auto plant, or even if they're in the same accounting firm, for white collar examples, the sons are actually making less in terms of inflation adjusted income than their fathers were, who in many cases are making less than their fathers were. And that you see that across the board. And that's one thing we really want to bring across in these human impact stories is that it's not just about blue collar workers. You always read about the guys in Detroit who've been working for Ford or GM for decades and how they're making less money. Or you read about rural poverty and farm workers who definitely have seen declines in wages. But it's across the board in white collar professions, from marketing analysts to travel agents to accountants, like I said, and hospital and healthcare workers. So just to describe the breadth of the workforce that's impacted by this income inequality is a key part of the series. And then the last part is just to look for solutions. And some of that is coming out of discussions in DC right now, a lot of energy about whether it's the infrastructure bill or other, pieces of legislation. But there's a lot that can be done, a lot that's not being discussed, and some things that are being discussed, like minimum wage increases or a return to strengthening unions and collective bargaining agreements. So those three legs of the stool are kind of the focus of the project.
So last week, the series put up a piece that's almost has like a clickbaity title, 14 shocking facts on inequality in working Americans and 6 stunning facts about the super wealthy. And these numbers are just mind-boggling. It's hard to even wrap your brain around some of what this is saying. Things like the median white family has 41 times more wealth than the median black family and 22 times more wealth than the median Latino family. And these statistics about what you're talking about, the very little change compared to the GDP. So how do you in this series get these things across truly to people to be able to wrap your brain around? I mean, these aren't new to me. I've seen a lot of this before, and I still can't really get it in my brain in a way that it makes any sense. So what's the plan in this series to help readers really try to grasp that?
I guess the plan is to a little bit of shock. I mean, a little bit of shock and awe, to borrow a terrible cliche, but it's effective sometimes. I think, I mean, it can be difficult because I think sometimes when readers, especially when they read about the 1% or the 0.001% and how much they own compared to the bottom 90%, the numbers are almost so mind-boggling that it doesn't really make sense. I mean, it's almost a phenomenon that happened with COVID, where once the numbers got so high, people couldn't really, it almost didn't have an impact as much. It almost had like a reverse effect where people cared less in some cases. So I think there's a danger there where sometimes some of these facts can be a little bit, they lose readers. So you look for information that I think makes more sense to people, like the idea that, half of US adults with lower incomes skip necessary medical care, because of the high cost, or the fact that, education costs have increased 600% more than incomes, or the fact that, 1 in 4 Americans have no retirement savings. I think those are more tangible facts that people can relate to because they either know it, down deep on a instinctive level, or just from, they have a sense that something like that is happening. And it puts a number to that sense, that notion that something's off. And then the second goal, I think, is to have people, think about, okay, what can be done here? This isn't like, like people often obviously talk about globalization, which was a big factor, definitely through the 90s and 2000s. But really since 2010, especially because salaries have gone up in China and other countries, globalization hasn't had that big of an impact. I mean, technology definitely does, but even that, is not always as pronounced as people think. So I think part of the goal with these facts and with the series in general is to get people to think like, okay, these are not, inexorable forces. Like, this doesn't have to be this way. This isn't like something like, oh, the world is changing and just there's nothing you can do about it. But a sense that they have the power to make change, either in terms of, policies they support, who they vote for. They're just to acquire more knowledge about, how these policies get passed or don't get passed. There's a lot of changes here that I think are unknown to most people. Like, one thing we're going to focus on is the overtime wage saga. How for a long time, overtime wages were pegged to a certain dollar amount, which was $29,000, I think back in like 81. And anybody who made more than that didn't qualify for overtime. So back then, that included a lot of people, who basically did qualify. But that number stopped being pegged to the consumer price index. So for 3 decades, until Obama tried to change it in 2013 or 14, it had a shrinking number of Americans who actually qualified for overtime. And it was one of those like small tweaks that just had been made that most Americans probably aren't aware of, but it had this, enormous impact on all kinds of working Americans that normally would qualify for overtime and would benefit from obviously those higher wages, especially because in many professions, people are working harder than ever to make the same wage, which basically means, a paid decrease when you're working more hours for the same wage. So
is this income gap, is this an American problem? I think you started to talk about that with the idea of globalization not really being, what is driving this. Is this something that, you said we don't need to sort of accept this and take this for granted. Is this something that other countries are figuring out, or at least some other countries are figuring out in ways better than what we are doing?
I think so. I mean, in general, there's obviously countries, that have extreme income disparities, like in Brazil and in Mexico. But in other countries in Europe, a lot of the OECD have more social mobility, where there's actually more people who, can come from the bottom and make it to the top. Even though that's sort of the American dream and part of the American myth, it's actually easier in many parts of Europe to make that change. And I think some of those countries were much smarter about handling the consequences of globalization. So once their factory workers, like in Germany or in France, started to, some of the companies started to outsource work to India or China or other countries with lower wages, that they did more to support their own, national workforces. Like there was more concern paid either in terms of keeping salaries at a certain level or giving them certain amounts of training. There was more support in a lot of those countries by the governments for those workforces. Whereas here, it became much more very libertarian, kind of free market model, the Jack Welch model from GE, just be lean and mean. You got to compete. You got to fire people and just, bring it down to the core, increase productivity, workers. If they're in the way, you just trim the fat and get rid of them. And that, I think, besides the immediate impact of people losing their jobs, of course, and losing income and being able to afford less and even become poor, there's a whole psychological mindset there too, that it ripped this kind of social contract we had in this country, where until like the 40s and 50s into the 60s, you read quotes from like the CEOs of GM and other big companies that talked about what's now referred to as stakeholder capitalism, that their priorities were to answer to their employees, their customers, the community, and their shareholders. And then somehow around the kind of late 70s, early 80s, through people like Jack Welch and some of the Chicago school economists, the focus became on shareholder primacy, that all that matters is making a profit. And there's dividends that go out to the shareholders. And everything else that gets in the way of that should be trimmed. And so that, I think, had a really devastating impact on kind of a sociological level, where this social contract we have in this country got ripped up. And it became, kind of a dog-eat-dog world, which has led us to where we are today, where people are really realizing like something's wrong here. When you have like, Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and others who have so much wealth that they kind of dominate in many respects in their sectors and have so much more money than literally tens of millions of Americans. There's something off there.
So we've been talking here some about federal policy, but one of the pieces that has come out has talked about state policy too. It talks about Arizona in particular. What role do you think that has in this country too, about having not just federal policies that affect workers and income, but also 50 different states plus DC with their own laws, and then maybe individual communities with their, cities and counties that may have laws too? How do we sort of look at all of that across an entire big country with a really diverse set of things that are going on, and try to figure out how to fix things, how to make the changes?
It's a good question. I mean, it's a big challenge. I think because, part of the design of, our democracy that has that divide between obviously federal and the states and localities, and that's not going to change overnight. And so I think what we need to do is find ways to, I think what's happened in a lot of countries, and you saw this happen in a lot of counties and states. I think you saw this happen obviously in the early 20th century, where all these big textile mills in the north went and moved down south, Alabama, Mississippi, and southern states, because they could pay workers less. There are fewer rules and regulations. And that's continued to this day, where obviously you have some states that are very, very poor and give very little public support to the poor, and other states that, are relatively European, you could say, whether it's New York or California. And I think, a lot of it is in the politics and in community organizing. And you see it in some ways, a model is the fight for 15 and minimum wage battles that have been, waged over the last 10 years, where it's become such a big issue, especially with retail chains and fast food restaurants, which are everywhere. And so you see more and more places, even like in Texas or, Arizona or other states that have traditionally been very conservative and very tight in their money and in their social policies. There's movements, especially among young people, I think, for more equity and to increase wages. And you've seen minimum wage increases in some of these states and in some of these cities that have not had the catastrophic effects that a lot of conservative politicians had predicted, that everyone, businesses would be demolished and they'd have to lay off workers en masse. And that hasn't really happened in almost every case with minimum wage increases. So there's a way, I think, that some groups, and whether it's unions or community organizations, are realizing that they can do the grassroots work and convince workers in other states who have long been kind of denied certain benefits and rights that there is a better tomorrow for them. It's not sort of a given that to be able to get a job and feed their families, they have to be paid, too little or not be able to organize. There was that case, obviously, in Alabama with the Amazon union organizing effort, which failed. That failed, but I think it was kind of stunning that it actually took place in the first place and there was any support, because I think people 5 years ago or 10 years ago would have right away written that off. And there's a little momentum for that to keep growing, especially as you see more scrutiny of big tech and more pressure to organize workers in those industries, and also more pressure to organize workers in healthcare and other professions like gig workers, which obviously we didn't have 15, 20 years ago. But there's more and more awareness of people, DoorDash or Instacart delivery people who kind of have no rights. And they're not even considered really employees. And so there's a lot of awareness, I think, that the newer, like economic, the more that the labor structures that we're kind of building for this century and for the future decades have their own inequities and maybe making it worse than ever. And young people are very aware of that, I think, especially, and realize that they can make changes. They can demand more, especially when you think about how their parents or grandparents lived in comparison.
So how can our listeners find and follow along with this series?
Well, we're going to be posting probably like 3 stories a month for the next at least 10 months to go, at least through the end of the year and beyond. So if you go to capitalandmaine.com, you'll find we have a very prominent button for 5100 pay gap. And that's where we have a landing page with all the stories we published so far. And like I said, about every week and a half, every 2 weeks, there'll be a new story. And they'll vary from these kind of human impact stories to stories about the racial wealth gap, which is a whole other story that deserves a lot more attention, to in-depth analysis stories, and to investigative reporting too. It's all there. And we're also very visible on social media, kind of pushing that. Like one of the reasons that we created sort of that 14 shocking facts on inequality in working Americans, that article you mentioned, is that a lot of those can be easily shared. So we made it very easy to share those on Twitter, where we could take each of those facts, those harsh facts that are stunning, and making it easy for users on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook to share those numbers. So, but capitalandmaine.com, that's where you'll find the series. And I would encourage listeners too, if they have ideas, either examples of things that they think are worth researching, whether it's wage theft or other, major factors that exacerbate income inequality, or to individual people whose profiles are worth telling because they exemplify this trend and what's happened. I encourage that.
Excellent. We'll put links up to that so people can find the series on social media, so that and so that they can share it as well. Marcus, is there anything else that you wanted to make sure we talk about today?
Yeah, I do. I think it's what's interesting is that there's that old cliche about never let a crisis go to waste. That's been used by both conservatives and liberals, and I think this is really a time. We've just been through this, and we're still suffering through this pandemic. And in many ways, as people might know, the pandemic has exacerbated income inequality, where you saw, I think we have a number in our list there about how, billionaires actually, grew their income by $1.62 trillion from March 2020 to April 2021, which would have paid for stimulus checks of $4,800 for every single American, including kids and the elderly. So I think there's an opportunity here because people are aware of that, and especially people who've lost jobs. And because of the way the economy has been upended, that there's an opportunity here to do something different, to step back and take a different approach to how we compensate people, the rights we give those people, those workers, how we structure companies, from co-management of boards. Instead of having just shareholders or outside directors on boards, you could have employees, as they do in some countries in Europe, where half the board of directors is employees, which has a big difference in how the companies run. There's a lot of different possibilities here to tweak things and change things and upend things, and in a way that is good for business and creates more jobs and creates better incomes for people and more benefits. So, amid all this chaos and this moment of crisis, there's an opening there, I think, for things to be done differently. And you see it even in our politics, where I think you do see discussion. It might be a little cynical, but you see it on the right too, among Republicans. A lot of talk, antitrust talk, a lot of suspicion of big corporations and big tech. And there might be an opening there for even a bipartisan effort to kind of change things. So we should take advantage of that.
Yes. Well, this is excellent, and I really look forward to reading the series as it comes out. So, Marcus, thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope people will really give us a good read.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Really appreciate it. And thank you to your listeners for reading.
Thank you for listening to Two Broads Talking Politics, part of the Dimcast Podcast Network. Our theme song is called Are You Listening? Off of the album Elephant Shaped Trees by the band Immunuri, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Weflin and was created for use by this podcast. You can contact us at twobroadstalkingpolitics@gmail.com or on Twitter or Facebook at Two Broads Talk. You can find all of our episodes at twobroadstalkingpolitics.com or anywhere podcasts are found.